what I wanted to talk about today, I just coined this topic myself. I was reading in esoteric astrology the other day, and I was talking about the tests that people undergo in Scorpio. Scorpio apparently sort of sets the stage for the threefold personality to get ready to develop, like a sense of orientation towards the real self or the soul or the higher self, prepare us for sort of more enlightened states, and also demonstrate a responsibility or an understanding of the plan for the whole of humankind, sort of thing. So I thought the topic that it was talking about three tests, and there's three stages to each test that people have to overcome in that sign. So what I thought I'd do is I'd come up with the topic. I'm going to call it the 9 tests to overcome on the path to becoming or being a decent, unselfish human being. And then I'm going to talk about each of these little signs and tests, and then we'll see where it goes. So basically she talked about 3 tests and 3 stages. So she said in Scorpio, she gave the examples in using some historical figures, like Hercules in Scorpio demonstrates the triumphant disciple. In other words, he uses the reasoning mind to overcome the physical appetites. So I've drawn that on this diagram here. So I've put 2 diagrams here. I've drawn the different levels of being on the left, which we've talked about before, and I've put the little energy centers on the right here because I want to tie together these little tests that we're going to talk about with the different planes and with the energy centers a little bit. So when you talk about the physical, which is the lowest plane here, in order to overcome the physical appetites, then you have to be able to use the mind to reason things through to their logical conclusions. So you use reason, the mind, to overcome the physical appetites. Then it talks about, in Taurus, it talks about the Buddha as an example of achieving victory over desire and arriving at illumination. So basically what happens there is the intuition overcomes the emotion. So lower desire becomes sensitive perception. So someone who's very intuitive can tune in and perceive the truth, things as they are. So a feeling becomes a sensitive perception of things as they are, as opposed to being dragged up and down by emotional pairs of opposites emotionally. So desire is overcome and you achieve wisdom. So wisdom is what you use to overcome emotion. And then in terms of the 3rd test, which is to do with the lower mind, we're talking about the challenge in Pisces, where the Christ overcame death and become the world's savior. So that's where spirit overcomes the mind itself. So that's why I've drawn these 3 little arrows. So higher will overcomes the lower will, self-will. So self-will becomes divine will, okay? Wisdom overcomes emotion, and reason overcomes physical, getting caught up in the physical desires in the world. So I thought I'd talk around those concepts. But you can also talk about those 3 ideas in relationship to the energy centers. So it's often talked about that below the diaphragm often represents the personality center. So when we get in trouble in health, we have a lot of issues usually with the solar plexus, which reflects the personal I or desire, the sacral area, which is your creative energy, and the physical, which relates to the physical and the root and, the family and the group and so forth. So, and the throat also is involved with the mind. So when you talk about wisdom, for example, overcoming emotion, the heart, which is more unconditional love, starts to overcome desire in the solar plexus, which is more desire and attached to between the pairs of opposites. Okay. Higher will, in terms of divine will, reflects in the crown, which overcomes the lower will and the root. Okay, and even mental will. And then reason, which is the mind, you could say the throat, which when it's balanced expresses pure reason, overcomes the physical appetites which relate to the root as well. Will relate to the sacral center mainly, which is the creative energies, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the throat and the sacrum are often linked. The solar plexus and heart are linked, and the spiritual will or this divine or spiritual center of the crown is often linked to the physical root center. And the third eye is usually an integrator. It integrates all the other centers. So that's a topic for another day, but I thought I'd just quickly show how each of these ideas relates to the levels and the centers. The reference for today's talk, the information, if you're interested, is from Alice Bailey, Esoteric Astrology, and it's pages 205 to 208. So I thought it'd make a really good topic for a talk. So what I'll do is I'll talk about each of these little tests, and then what we'll do is we'll open it up for discussion a little bit after that. So I'll do a little talk around this first and just discuss it, but I wanted to discuss it in a little bit of line with what's happening in the world at the moment. If you think about the motives that are driving people in the world to do what they're doing right now, okay? So you've got to keep in mind there are two different motives. There's motives. Motive is everything. It's how these different things are used. For example, with the test of appetite, sex, physical comfort, and money, these are not bad things in themselves. They actually can be quite healthy. But all of these things you can do with a selfish motive, which is more apparent. I said apparent win-lose because basically it means that everything you do, you're doing it to take, to make sure the self is satisfied, but that could come at the detriment of other people. So a person, when they're operating from a selfish intent, it's all about them, and they try to get what they want, but they don't care what sort of cost it has to other people. So it's a win-lose situation, but it's only apparent win because ultimately when you misuse or abuse energy or other people, it bounces back. So it ends up resulting in no one winning. It's a lose-lose situation. The other option is to use these things, these tests, and come to a point where you understand what they mean from a selfless perspective. So the selfless perspective is basically a sharing and caring perspective where everybody wins. It's for the benefit of everybody without exclusion. Okay, so as I talk about each of these 9 little tests that we have to master, the basic underlying theme is, are we acquiring these things or using these things for selfish purposes or selfless purposes? And the end result, the result of mastery over these little tests, has to do with achieving right relationships to our higher healthy self, our divine self, and also a healthy relationship between ourselves and our environment and other people. So obviously the benefits not only benefit ourselves, but everything, including nature. Okay, so that's the idea. So, and I've just put my little diagram here of the bucket of personality on the right side of this picture to sort of demonstrate that if we're aligning our energies, our minds, our emotions, and our bodies with health, and then overflow that health or that truth or that love with other people, then it's sharing and caring. It's overflowing the waters of ourself, our energies with other people, so everyone gets uplifted. But when we operate from a selfish perspective, this is this little blue mark here on the right side of the diagram, we get off balance. We attach our energies to an issue or a belief system or an emotion or an object and lose touch with who we really are. And then it's all about the ego. This is the ego, you could say. It's the attachment to an illusion or to something which isn't actually real. Whereas as I call that the separative self, and the true self or the individual self is all aspects of our system in alignment with our healthy life energy and source. So with that in mind, let's talk about these different topics. The first test is the test of appetite, which is relating a lot to the physical plane. So in Alice Bailey, she talks about 3. There's been sex, physical comfort, and money. So if you look at the sexual energy in people in the planet, there's a lot of, obviously you can use sexual energy, which is simply creative energy. So this relates a lot to the sacral center. The sacral center has got a lot to do with polarity, and it's the balanced relationship between the positive and negative, the masculine and the feminine energies in ourselves. So obviously, if you're using sexual energy creatively, it is the basis behind forming healthy relationships with not only other people, partners, but, you know, mother, father and son or daughter, between siblings and between work colleagues and between anybody. Okay, So, and between right relationships between ourselves and the business, because the product of healthy relationships and the highest element of creative energy is propagation of the species. It's create a new life, to create a newborn. Okay, the purpose of a business, for example, is the product or of a creative endeavor of any sort is a product. Okay, so whether that's a business or whether that's a relationship in terms of a baby or anything else that you're making, creative energy is used to create and make and produce, which manifests in the physical world. So if you're using it in a healthy sense, it's mutual, it's interactive, it's win-win, everyone benefits. So the sexual energy, when it's used in a relationship, if you're channeling your energies correctly through all different levels of your being, then you're overflowing and you're interacting with another person in a very healthy way, which should have the effect of uplifting both of you, not depleting either of you. Make sense? If you misuse the energy, now a lot of the issues in the world at the moment, and it's been going on for eons, is the misuse and abuse and manipulation of sexual energy for personal gratification. Okay, so what that means is a person is really not thinking about the other person, they're just thinking about getting what they want. Now, that results in the most common result of that is abuse, sexual abuse. So, in other words, people taking from other people to get personal satisfaction, basically. The other person's left abused and violated. Okay, so what happens when you get out of balance between the positive and the negative poles is it becomes a victimizer scenario. So in other words, it goes from a mutual balance to one person getting what they want at the other person's expense, which ultimately, as I said before, is a lose-lose situation. Sooner or later, that person suffers the imbalance of that misuse and abuse of energy. So in our bodies, for example, the sacral energy, the creative energy, if it's linked to the solar plexus and desire and emotion, people are operating from pure desire, not from loving their heart. So when someone starts to connect their heart to their sacral center, they're starting to transmute desire and express love through their sexual energies with another person or in relationships with any situation. So you end up dissolving attachments and desires and instead creating loving connections, okay, which benefit everybody. And therefore you don't deplete your energies. So those sacral energies or the sexual energies are actually risen up to a higher source, to the heart or the head or whatever other center you're using it for. If you're using it to create art or to create music, you're channeling that creative energy into your offspring of producing music or producing art. So it's the same thing. You're just channeling it to use your higher centers, maybe the throat or the head or the heart. So think about it like that. So, and as you know, the selfish, the misuse and abuse of creative energies ends up with that victimizer sort of consciousness. And the end result of that is not good for everybody. But that's rampant, unfortunately, in the world. The amount of people, both men and women, that have had abuse is phenomenal in today's day and age. And it just does your head in to even think about it. But that doesn't need to happen if we learn to understand the nature of our creative energies. So probably don't need to talk any more about that one. You can sort of work out any extra bits from that. But a lot of people's abuse, a lot of the issues that are to do with the sexual energy and relationships come from some abuse, usually in the past. So it doesn't matter what person's inclinations are sexually, but in the end, every individual sooner or later has to come into balance with their masculine and their feminine energies, bring them into mutual balance so that you're not victimized. So a lot of people, for example, have had trauma from the opposite sex. Eventually, they're going to have to come to grips with that and learn to handle that energy. And that's particularly easy to facilitate when people come into a relationship with someone who's very loving and caring, because that helps people to let go of their issues. Okay, gives them an example of what the right relationship is supposed to be about. So I'll move on to the second one. Second one is physical comfort. So what you're trying to do with physical comfort. There's nothing wrong with physical comfort, but if you look at the average person on the planet, a lot of people's motives and goals in life is to have a house, to have a car, to have a family, maybe a boat and a caravan to go away for holidays. A lot of things that people work for is working to make sure they've got comfort and security, okay, in life. And without that comfort and security, they get stressed and anxious and worried. But the thing to think about is if that physical comfort is just a desire to keep yourself comfortable, but at the detriment of people around you. So a lot of people, for example, so long as they're happy and the environment around them is happy, they're not too concerned with what's happening in the other side of the world in a country where people are starving, or they're not that concerned with events that happen on the other planet that are so far away they think it's having no impact on them. You know, for example, if someone drops a bomb in the ocean on the other side of the world, people think it's out of mind, out of sight, it's not going to have any impact here. But we know that everything is interrelated energetically. When you do something to one part of the system, other parts of the system have to compensate or adjust. So as you start becoming more aware, you start to realize that it's fine to have comfort, but you want to make sure when you go from you're transmuting desire for individual comfort to or the selfish acquisition of things for personal gain. So it's got nothing to do with whether you're a good or a bad person. Good people and bad people themselves still desire comforts, okay? But it goes from using those comforts selfishly to comfort for all. In other words, the sharing and distribution of goods for the good of the whole. And so you start to change your motive again from self, winning, and no concern for others, to actually having concern for everybody. So you'll overflow your comforts onto other people. Does that make sense? So that's the idea. So have a think about that. So, and if those comforts are threatened, I was trying to think of an example of for example, if something were to happen, you know, and there was like, you know, let's say there was a food shortage, for example. Well, you saw that in the pandemic. For some unknown reason, people worried about toilet paper and they were worried about their physical comforts going without, right? So people raided the supermarkets and hoarded all the toilet paper and all the food with no concern for everybody else, right? As long as they were happy and they had their resources, they were happy and they didn't worry about it. And then the government and the supermarkets would have had to step in and say, and actually put a sign there saying everyone's limited to 2 or 1 of these objects, so that it actually could distribute the goods to everyone equally, so no one was going without. So you can see that the consequences of that means you might have, I mean, it's ridiculous, but this is what happened here. People run out, I mean, they'll take or steal other people's food just so they're happy. And that's a test, because are we willing to think about the well-being of everybody and share our resources, or are we really concerned with ourselves? So that comes back to motive again. Okay, so that's probably the most practical example I can come across thinking about what's happening at the moment. So, but if everyone shared their resources with everybody else in the world, there wouldn't be, no one would go without. Everyone would be supported. Okay, I think there's more than enough resources. But in order to share resources, the haves and the have-nots, people have to share the resources, not just hoard them. Okay, not the 1% having everything and the 99% going without. That sort of thing. It gets out of balance. So the last thing to talk about here is money. Okay, so money itself really just represents energy. So it's the sharing and distribution of energy. When it's hoarded and stored away and not shared, then you get that situation where you have the rampant acquisition of money to selfishly dominate, separate, or segregate the haves from the have-nots. And as it's transmuted to the higher sharing, caring element, you've got the selfless distribution of money or energy so that there's no lack and everyone is sustained. So that's sort of pretty clear. But the reason I wanted to talk about money is that when this concept of business and money has crept into every element of life, like universities, they're only concerned with funding, so they shortcut their courses and the students, and they get less teachers and more student to teacher ratio. So, for example, a lot of them, just so they can get their money and their funding. Okay, so in other words, if the motive becomes about money instead of about sharing and caring and actually a good quality education or a good quality anything, then you can suddenly lose your way and go from a healthy motive to a motive of just making money. So a lot of people judge success in the physical world by acquisition of money or power or goods. Okay, so if your business, in order, people say, well, I started a business. I watched something, last night on the YouTube, someone talking about, someone getting the idea to make hair combs or whatever, and they made a successful business out of it. But you can make a successful business that makes a lot of money and sells good products or whatever. But does making money come at the detriment of other people? That's a question worth asking. Okay. If your making money is there to support the system and to produce good products and good educational tools, good medical aid, good everything like that, that actually helps people and comes at an affordable cost and price, you've kept your motive of caring and sharing that's affordable by everybody and not at the abuse of everybody. Okay, not taking from the people. So, for example, a lot of medical things, medical developments, people slap on a hefty price. You might pay $20,000 for a pill that most people can't afford. Okay, because the value goes on the money you can make from the product as opposed to the caring element done for the good of the well-being of the whole. So that's obviously a big temptation. What else can I say about that one? But that's a big one. You see a lot of people in the health field, for example, they come up with a course and they think, and then they're told by the business marketing model that if you don't put a nice price on your product, that you don't value yourself. Now, I think that's absolute crap. If your motive is money and you don't put a hefty price on, then you're devaluing yourself because your motive is making money. But if you put your motive on helping people, then the way you measure your success is by how many people you help. It has nothing to do with the amount of money you make. Does that make sense? So if you've got to keep the motives pure. In fact, the person who truly loves and truly cares and truly gives would be happy doing what they do for nothing and do really good work. That doesn't devalue them because their motive is pure. Okay. Now, sure, in the way we live in the world, we need to make sure that we have comfort. This is linked in with comfort as well. We need to make sure that we are able to survive and we're able to thrive, in fact. But if you sell a product and you put 3 or 4 times the price on it, you see it with clothes, you see it with all sorts of things. Some people will sell the same product at 4 or 5 times the cost. Some plumbers will charge 5 or 6 times the rate just because they can than other plumbers. So it happens in all aspects of life. And then when you look at YouTube and you look at, there's all these ads about, are you making your money? How much value are you putting on yourself? You can make, it's all, even well-meaning people and spiritual people are still getting caught up in the world to a subtle degree and placing their motive on the money rather than on the actual quality of the service. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. But in order to pass and master the appetites, you need to make sure, this is why I bring it back to the motive. You want to make sure that, yes, it's fine to have all these things and acquire all these things, but it needs to come not to the detriment of other people. Okay, it has to be mutually beneficial. So I think that's the key thing to ask. If you think about anything in life and you think, is this good for me? Is this good for other people? And let's say you get a tick tick, then it's a win-win situation. It's probably the right thing to do. Okay, so that's something to think about. So then we talk about the test connected with desire. Okay, that's the second one. This is related to the emotional state. So the 3 here are fear, hatred, and ambition. And apparently this links very, very strongly in with the physical appetites as well, because it has an effect on the physical. It immediately affects the body. So if you look at fear, for example, if you look at what's happening in the world at the moment with all this, these issues with COVID and control and manipulation and censorship and everything like that. Fear is a big one that's been propagated. People can propagate fear to compel or control people to do what they want, because when people are afraid, it's like saying you want people. If people are afraid, then you can basically say, all right, I'll protect you at this cost. Okay, you give up some of your power and privileges and I'll protect you. So it's like people are easily manipulated when they're fearful. To transmute fear, you've got to transmute it into love. Okay, and as one starts to, this is why it talks about overcoming desire and fear. If you reason it through and you use your intuition and you start tapping into the heart, you start to become more wise and illumined, and that starts to overcome fear, because you realize that fear is really an illusion in itself. Okay, so there's a beautiful quote in the Course in Miracles which I like, and it goes something like this: true love is the absence of fear. So when fear exists, you're not in a state of true love. But only true love exists. So if you're living in fear, you're living in a state which does not exist. So that's using wisdom to reason through the consequences of fear. That's another very good book to have a look at, Course in Miracles. What else can I say about fear? Okay, so I'll go on to hatred. Hatred is really separating things. It's creates separation and division between people. So that's something we'll have to overcome. Now, a classic example here might be, I've been through this. When you're in love with somebody and you're in a relationship and you get married, you get married because you love somebody, faults and all. Now, when people separate, when things don't go so well, people separate. I find this, it doesn't make any sense to me, but when people separate, they think there has to be an excuse to, they have to now hate the person in order to separate. They can't keep loving them because they sort of think you either love someone or you hate someone. So people can tend to think, well, now they go from loving person to hating a person. And you can't ever do that. You can't stop loving a person. You may disagree with, they may not be living, one or other may not be living a very healthy, and they might not be manifesting a loving relationship, and they might have issues that are interfering in the relationship. But you don't stop loving the person, because really when you're loving someone, you're loving the health in the person. You're loving, looking at this diagram, you're loving the part of them that's healthy and connected, not the part that's attached to the ego. Okay. But when the ego gets in control, thinks it has to hate the person. So you get these people that have been looking after each other for years, suddenly try in a legal court of action, court of law, try to take the other person for everything they've got. They're so hurt and abused and manipulated that now they think I'm going to try and take that person. And so they end up going to court and no one wins except the lawyers. Okay, so to overcome that, if you start to think, well, you can never stop loving someone, you're just moving off in different directions. The way to overcome that would be you try to combat hatred with peace and unity, bring it back to unity and balanced relationship. So fear is overcoming that in yourself. Hatred is overcoming separation between other people to come to a mutual understanding and balance. So if you sat down with a person and you actually had their interests at heart, you would, when you split up in a relationship, you wouldn't need lawyers. You'd just sit down and you'd say, all right, what have we got? What have we contributed? We need to arrange this so that both of us come out happy and looked after. Okay, now that should be the easiest thing in the world for people to do, so that two people, whenever a relationship breaks up, they both come out for supported and sustained. And this gets onto that point of that win-lose situation, in that when you end up fighting in conflict, the lawyers get all the money that comes from the conflict and you end up with less. Whereas if you had sat down mutually in understanding and love and support, you would have been able to come up with something where everyone benefits and no one loses. Okay, except for perhaps the lawyer is making money off other people's, the bad lawyer, other people's conflicts. The good lawyer will try and resolve the conflicts with minimal cost and interference to all parties. Then you've got ambition or desire for personal power. So ambition, again, implies, you're running out to acquire stuff okay, and desire for, well, it's not even personal power, it's just power. What happens there is that, you can look at this in the world, the big corporations, big pharma, or big businesses, and not all businesses are like this, but a lot of the time, because money is the big goal and physical comfort, okay, people have ambition to make more and more money, acquire more and more power, more and more material gain, but they don't consider the well-being of the people that they're taking that power from, okay? So you have the corporations that try to control and dominate and to benefit themselves, but if it comes to at the cost of disempowering other people or to the detriment of other people, then that actually tests your motive. If your motive is to help, the idea would be to share power and resources so that everyone is empowered and lifted equally. So that's the idea. What else can I say about that? Oh, and I gave the example there. For example, I remember I wrote an article on motives, and I said, well, for example, if a farmer has a fruit tree, and that fruit tree provides many apples, let's say, for example, and when you pick the fruit, it feeds several families in the local vicinity. Well, the big businessmen will come along, they'll rake the fruit tree, take all its resources, sell it to the supermarkets, and they sell it back to the farmer at a cost. So in other words, what they do is they literally are raping the resources of nature for personal gain and then selling it back to the people at a cost. And that's, if you look at what's actually happening, is that sustainable? Is it actually supporting nature and supporting people? And it isn't. So that would be the misuse of power, and then justifying it because you seem to be successful. So obviously, when we master power or ambition, we do things for the greater good. Okay, we do things for a win-win, so that we can acquire power and confidence, but then we overflow that confidence onto others and teach them how to do things for themselves, so that everybody is equally empowered. And then there's the test of the lower critical mind. So that's pride, separateness, and cruelty. So you combat pride. Pride is basically excessive self-satisfaction. It's like putting yourself above other people. And as you grow in wisdom and understanding, you realize that everyone's equal. Everyone has this same divine life energy in them. So equality is the counterbalancing point. Pride just turns to equality. And when you think about the good of other people, it helps to rebalance. Separativeness is, it sort of goes along with this fear and hatred. It separates and divides. And the idea there is to unify and bring things together, to create unity, not separation. And the last one there is cruelty. So cruelty, it says in the Alice Bailey that the worst type of cruelty is more mental in character, not physical. So what happens there is that, and I use the example, I use this in a different article I wrote on to try and help people understand the causes behind the effects. So if you have someone at work who's mentally, psychologically, emotionally abusing someone else, and they're hammering and they're at them and they're just badgering them, and then one day that person has had enough and they lash out and physically abuse their psychological abusers, then all of a sudden there's an emergency situation and people go, oh my God, this shouldn't be physically abusing everybody. So the police will come and they'll throw that person in jail. But what's actually happened is the person who's been mentally and emotionally cruel and abusive is getting away scot-free. They've caused the whole situation and they've driven another person mad to the point where they've literally lashed out. And then everyone thinks, this is the symptomatic approach. Everyone thinks, oh, we've dealt with the symptom, everyone's back to normal. But the only thing they've done is they've pacified the situation and thrown the real victim in jail. And so that's what happens in any chronic health issue. People are so over-focused on the effects that they miss the underlying problems beneath the scene that are causing the problem in the first place. So a more aware person would look at the whole situation, they'd start noticing that this worker was stressed and suffering, and they'd talk to them and find out who the real culprits were, and then they'd have a good talk to the people who are psychologically being cruel and abusive. And that'd actually mean it's a win-win for everybody, and not the poor person who's lost and in jail and they're suffering because their real cause is not being dealt with. So that's the idea. So the goal of this, if you come back to motive, We've got less than a minute to go, by the way. I've gone on as usual. You can see that in every case, if your goal is for a win-win for everybody, then your solution and that's how you tell that your motives are balanced. And that'll relate in right relationships between our lower self and our higher self, and in relationship between ourself, the environment, and other people. And that when we do that, we pass all these tests. And and everything we do is done with loving respect, unity, love, connectedness, and loving non-attachment, you could say.